Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. So this is the first week that we're going to really focus on a more specific topic. So we have discussed in week 1 what crime is and how it is constructed and the morals of it all and the background to forensic psych. And then in week 2 we discussed about theory and what types of theories are used to explain criminal offending. So now we're going to move on to discussing the specific topic of juvenile delinquency and juvenile justice. So by the end of this week, you should be able to explain the extent of juvenile offending. So statistically, how many of them are there and who are they? Describe the types of adolescent offenders because they are not just one homogenous group. Understand the term life course criminology. So we might talk about the difference between adolescent limited offending compared to life course criminality. And what we're interested in here is when they start offending, the patterns and types of offences, and when they stop offending. We're going to discuss the risk and protective factors for delinquency and adolescent offending. So if a risk factor increases the risk of someone becoming a criminal, what is a protective factor and how do these actually work? Understand the theories of adolescent offending. So again, we're going to refer back to theories, which is going to continue to happen through all of your courses. And we're going to describe and understand what works in terms of intervention programs. And we're going to look at some intervention programs to see what's happening out there in the big wide world. Okay, first of all, we're going to look at the statistics and the types of juvenile criminals. So bring on the numbers. All right. We need to define what we mean by juvenile. So all of the states have ages that they consider that a child cannot be held criminally responsible. In Queensland, it is 10. So at the age of 9, a child is not considered to have the intellectual capacity to decide the difference between right and wrong. In England, the age of criminal responsibility is 10. So this was changed due to the James Bulger case that we looked at way back in week 2 in 1013, where 2-year-old Jamie was murdered by 2 10-year-old boys who were held criminally responsible for his death. In other words, they were tried as adults. That meant they needed to understand what was going on in the court, the severity of their charge, how to give instruction to their defence, and all those sorts of things. And I don't think 10-year-olds really have the mental capacity to do that, but that is what is decided under British law. If they're aged from 10 to 13, then the principle of Dolly Incapax applies. So what this means is that the child is presumed incapable of the crime and the prosecution has to prove that the child actually did understand that what they were doing was wrong. So there has been talk of raising the age of responsibility to 12 and removing the Dolly Incapax. So nothing really has happened, and I think there's a lot of other stuff going on in the world at the moment that's probably gone by the by at this point in time. Okay, in 2018, in February, in Queensland, the age of transition to the adult system changed in Queensland to 18. Prior to that, it was 17. So what this means is that 17-year-olds are now charged under the Youth Justice Act and not tried as adults. And if they are incarcerated, they can only go to youth detention and not to jail. So there's only, at the time this law change happened in 2018, there was only about half a dozen, maybe up to 10 or so young people who were in adult prison who were aged 17, but now there will be none. So what happens is if they are in prison on their 18th birthday in juvenile detention, they will transfer over to the adult jail. I think Ken spoke about this last year when he spoke to you about how they have a transition program for those young people moving from youth detention to big boys jail, but that is what the law is here. All right, let's look at some rates. So the juvenile offending rates, you can see there what it was in 2016-17. Those juveniles made up about 13% of the total offender population. But their offending rate per 100,000 can be a little bit higher sometimes than the general public, which is really quite concerning. There's 4 most common offences. Theft at 36%, probably given that that's what most of them are going to be involved in, especially cars at the moment. Acts intended to cause injury, so things like homicide are very, very rare. This will be more street fighting and things like that. Public order offences, quite low. And illicit drugs, even though that seems quite low, it's low because the girls' rates are quite low and they bring the overall rate down a bit, but it is quite high in boys. Sexual assault is really quite low. But if you have a look in the statistics, you will find that there are 10-year-old males and females committing this offence. I think that if you have 10-year-olds who are committing sexual assault offences, you're going to be looking really hard at what's happening in their homes and what's being modelled to them and what they're actually able to watch, like on TV, their access to pornography, as it were. Of those found guilty, 90% sentenced to non-custodial orders, so actually only 10% get a custodial order in detention. That rate could be even lower at the moment because the Queensland Government has a very, very firm policy of not locking youth juveniles in. I'll start that again. Queensland State Government has a policy at the moment of not putting young people into detention. They don't want young people locked up. They want to try and work with them in the community. The opposition, as we have an election in October, has started to bring out policy, and one of the policies that they've brought out is a 3 strikes policy. So they're willing to give young people a couple of chances on the outside. The 3rd time that they offend, they will be put into custody. So just keep watching the media because law and order is going to be a really, really big issue that's going to be discussed coming up to the state election in October, and you should be interested in listening to what both sides say that they have to do before you form any opinions on whether they're good or bad or indifferent. So we'll have a look at all of the offences, or not the offences, but the ages of the offenders. So as you can see, at 10 years old, which is at the first age that they can actually go before the court, the numbers are quite low, working all the way up to 17 years. So we start with 645 at 10. By the time we get to 17 years, we're at nearly 14,500. And this is only the ages of those who've gone to court. So there'd be a lot more that would have got warnings or let off without going to court. Have a think about why, from about 15 years onwards, the numbers rise substantially. Well, we can talk about this in class, but I think that, you could probably figure out that when young people hit about 15, parental supervision may not be quite as tight as it was at a younger age. So young people, when they hit about 15, the line is loosened a little bit and they're allowed to have a little bit more freedom to go out with their friends without their parents being there. Those who are in the 15 to 17 year age group may partake in more risky behaviours, which is not uncommon as well. It could also be just because the younger ones get warnings and don't end up going to court because they are younger. But a lot of it's to do with the fact that the older teenagers are more mobile and are able to get around a lot more and have that little bit extra freedom. So what does it look like by gender? Well, females committed 27.8% of the crime, whereas males committed 71% of the crime. So as you can see, by gender, males still are outstripping the girls by almost 3 to 1. But what about intergenerational family offending? Does crime run in families? Well, rather than looking at whether crime runs in families, so is there a genetic link or whatever, the question is more about what's causing it. Because if crime does run in families, it's probably more environmental. It's likely to be related to the environment that you grow up in. If you grow up in a family where crime is normal, then for you it will probably become the norm as well. So statistics show that 1/3 of prisoners in the UK also had a family member in prison, and 53% of males who had a convicted family member had a conviction themselves. But this last point here is really quite telling because it's showing that a very, very small proportion of crime families are committing most of the crime. So if it does run in these families, they're responsible for an awful lot of crime happening. So where does that leave the young people in those families? Okay, so what are the types of juvenile offenders? Because they are not all the same. First of all, as we've discussed, most offending occurs at about 16 to 17 years, although we do see a peak around the 15 to 18 mark. Most of them desist from crime once they reach adulthood, and it's like a bell curve from young to old. Those convicted earliest tend to become the most persistent offenders, and I will talk a little bit more about this very shortly, because there is something about those who offend at a very young age having a persistent career and not growing out of it. Recidivism rates are high for young offenders, so we know that they may not just commit one crime before they cease and desist, it may be a couple, but they're rarely imprisoned for a single offence. So you need to commit many crimes, more than just the one or two, before you're sent to detention, because it's a last resort. And, you know, I think a good example of that was the young man who was recently arrested for stealing a car and driving it from the Gold Coast to the Sunshine Coast. He actually had been the driver in a car where someone was killed, and yet he was still not incarcerated. So, you know, they have to be really quite bad before they're going to actually get put into detention. And this is your bell curve. Okay, so this was research done by Moffat in New Zealand, and we're looking at two different types of offences. So we're looking at those who go on to commit crime for most of their lives, compared to the limited offenders who will peak in that 15 to 18 age group, but then go on to lead blemish-free lives. Why does this happen? What are the reasons for some ceasing and some being persistent? Well, they differ. So your life course persistent offender will start off offending at a very early age. And by early, I'm talking here about maybe around 4 to 5 years of age. And their offending is not what we probably think of as offending, but you've got a 4 to 5 year old who can be extremely aggressive to other children consistently, externalizing their behaviour, not able to take direction, and generally one of those kids that you look at and you just shake your head and think, oh my God, what's going to happen to this kid? So those behaviours that they're exhibiting at the age of 4 to 5, by the time they're 15, they can be involved in things like shoplifting. At 18, they'll be stealing cars. These days, much younger than that, they'll be stealing cars. And in their 20s and 30s, they will be quite violent and be committing quite serious crime. These life course persistent will commit a wide range of offences, including violence. And they are a very small group of offenders, accounting for most of the crime. And it's important to remember that they are a very small group. Anyone who works with young people, and I worked with young people for a couple of decades with cadets, and most of the young people that I saw were good young people. And I would like to think that in the greater scheme of things, that most young people are good young people. Whereas your adolescent limited offender has a very short criminal career and they commit predominantly rebellious, non-violent crimes, things like graffiti and other rebellious stuff like that, but not violence, not serious violence at all. Okay, that's the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to discuss life course criminology and risk and protective factors in more depth. Thank you for listening.